where the rain fell softest on the helmets. I remember the sound before I remembered the sight. It was not the harsh slap of rain on tin, not the relentless drumming that turns the earth to rivers, but something softer, almost shy tapping, as if the clouds had decided that morning not to wake the whole camp. It came in a rhythm that seemed to lean forward and pause, lean forward and pause, as though the sky itself was unsure whether to stay with us or drift away. The first time I noticed it, I was sitting on the edge of my cot, my boots half laced, my hands still slow from sleep. The canvas roof above me trembled with every drop, each movement making the light in the tent sway in its own silent dance. I had slept in the rain before too many times to count, but this was different. This was not a storm's declaration. It was a secret. And secrets in those days were rare. I tilted my head, trying to catch where it was falling the softest. And that's when I saw it. Outside, a row of helmets resting on the wooden bench near the mess tent. They were all turned upside down, like little bowls waiting for soup, but the rain barely touched them. A thin branch above them caught most of the drops, letting only a few slip through, and those few drops landed as if they were afraid to break the silence. The helmets shone faintly, not with the sharp glare of sun on steel, but with the muted gleam of something that has learned to endure. Some belonged to men I knew, others to faces I had only seen in passing. Yet, in that moment, they all looked the same, a single line of curved metal, each holding a piece of the sky. I walked closer. The air smelled of damp wood and boiled coffee drifting from the mess tent. My boots pressed into the soft earth, and I could feel the ground breathing back the night's rain. The helmets waited, quiet, as if their owners had left them there on purpose to be washed by something gentler than our hands. I reached out to touch one, and the coolness of it startled me. It's not the kind of cold that bites, but the kind that feels like a long exhale, like water held too long in a stone cup. I wondered how many mornings it had seen, how many times it had been lifted to meet a sky that offered no shelter. You think about these things when you're young and the world is still sharp. Back then, a helmet was just part of the uniform, like the buttons you fasten without thought. But after months, after the mud, after the way the days start blending until the only difference between them is the direction of the wind, you start noticing the small mercies. And that morning, mercy looked like rain falling soft enough to be kind. I sat on the bench beside them, the branch above dripping at its own slow pace. Each drop made a sound that was more felt than heard. The kind of sound that can fold itself into your heartbeat until you can tell where one ends and the other begins. Someone walked past, their boots squelching in the wet earth, and I expected them to say something, a joke, a complaint, anything, but they only glanced at the helmets and kept going. Maybe they felt it too, that unspoken rule that some moments are not to be disturbed. When you live among soldiers, you start to read silence like a second language. There's the silence of exhaustion, the silence of fear, the silence of remembering things you wish you could forget. But there's also this one, the silence that feels like a blanket pulled up to your chin, the one that makes you close your eyes for just a moment longer. I thought of writing about it in my notebook, but the pencil felt too heavy that morning. Instead, I simply stayed there, watching the rain choose where to fall. Some drops hit the earth with tiny puffs of dust, some slid off the leaves, and some, just a few, found their way onto the helmets, leaving circles that slowly disappeared into the metal. It made me think, maybe the rain knows more than we do. Maybe it understands which battles are worth softening, which places deserve gentleness. Later, when the others came to retrieve their helmets, they didn't seem to notice. They shook off the few drops, fastened the chin straps, and moved on. But I noticed, and I kept noticing, every time the rain returned, not just the noise it made, but where it chose to fall the softest. That day, when I wore mine, I swore I could still feel it, the cool memory of the morning's touch. The way it had waited for me, the way it had not rushed to tell me anything, only to be present. It's strange how the smallest things stay. You'd think you'll remember the loud moments, the shouting, the orders, the thunderbutt. Those blur over time. What remains clear is a helmet catching shy rain in the early light, and the way it seemed to know the weight of every head it had carried. And as I lay in my bunk that night, the sound returned, not from outside, but from inside my own memory. The same soft tapping, patient, unhurried. I closed my eyes and let it fall, not on steel this time, but somewhere far more fragile. That night, as the rain kept visiting in my memory, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in months. I was safe enough, at least for a few hours, to notice beauty. War does something cruel to the mind. It makes beauty feel like a luxury, an extravagance you can't afford. You start to believe that you have no right to stop and watch the way steam curls off a mug, or how the wind hesitates before changing direction. But that morning, the rain gave me permission. It wasn't the kind of beauty you can show in a photograph. No one back home would understand why it speaks so softly about helmets on a bench, about rain too timid to be heard over footsteps. They'd expect tales of bravery, of daring escapes, of luck so thin it could tear. But here, in the slow places between the hours, this was the bravery allowing myself to be still when the world wanted us always moving. I remember leaning forward, elbows on my knees, my breath clouding faintly in the cool air. The branch above swayed with the weight of water, and I found myself waiting for each drop, as though its arrival might mean something, and maybe it did. Maybe the meaning wasn't in the drop itself, but in the space between them. I thought about the men whose helmets they were. O'Connell, with the laugh that startled crows. Rivas, who carved tiny animals from scraps of wood and kept them hidden in his kit. And Michelson, who rarely spoke, but when he did, he spoke as if each word was weighed before it left his mouth. I imagined each of them under that branch, long before I had woken. Their helmets drying from yesterday's rain, their faces turned to the sky with the same question I carried. Would today take more than it gives? One of the helmets had a small dent in the crown, the metal pushed inward as if the world had tapped it with a hard, careless finger. I didn't know whose it was, but I traced the dent with my fingertips. Smooth edges now, worn from the handling of hands that must have carried it through too much. In the right light, it looked almost like a crater. And for a moment, I imagined I was holding a small moon that had traveled far and survived. Beyond the mess tent, the field stretched into a pale fog, the edges of the horizon swallowed in silver. The rain made tiny rings in puddles, and the puddles reflected branches that seemed to hang upside down in another world. I thought about walking out there, letting the rain find me, but something held me to the bench. Perhaps it was the rare peace of being in one place long enough to belong to it, even if only for an hour. The cook stepped out of the tent, his apron already damp, and nodded to me. He didn't say a word, but I smelled the bread before I saw it fresh, warm, and impossibly kind in a place that often forgot kindness. He set 2 loaves on the windowsill, steam rising into the morning like a promise. "Okay." I watched him return inside, the flap of the tent falling close behind him. The helmets waited still, their curved shells catching the slow light that filtered through the clouds. And I thought, perhaps this is what keeps us human, the small acts we do without reason. The way we place our helmets in a row and trust the rain to do its work. I stayed until the others began to emerge, their boots sucking at the wet ground, their voices still thick from sleep. O'Connell grabbed his helmet first, turning it over to shake off the water. He didn't notice me watching. Rivas took his tucking a piece of bread into the strap, before fastening it to his head. Kelson S. was last. He placed it on with the care of a man putting a crown back where it belongs. When they left, I was alone with the empty bench. The branch above shook once, twice, sending a small flurry of drops to the ground. And I thought how many times had this scene played out without me. How many mornings had the rain fallen soft while I slept through it? It made me wonder what else I had missed while looking only for the loud signs of life. That night, when the lamps were dimmed and the only light came from the thin crack beneath the tent flap, I lay awake and listened. Not to the rain outside, but to the rain inside my head, the soft rhythm it had left behind. It was no longer just a sound, okay? It was a place I could return to, a place where nothing was asked of me except to notice. Morning came again with the same pale light, the kind that makes everything seem suspended between waking and dreaming. I rose before the bugle, moving quietly so as not to stir the others, and stepped outside into air that still carried the scent of last night's rain. The bench was empty at first. I thought perhaps the helmets had been taken in for the night, or that the branch had dropped its protection and the rain had been too heavy. But as I walked toward the mess tent, I saw them, 5 of them, this time resting in a perfect line, all facing the same way. Someone had taken the time to position them so neatly that it felt almost ceremonial. I wondered who had done it. Was it simply habit? Or was there someone else here who, like me, noticed the way the rain fell differently in this one small patch of the camp? I took a seat again, the dampness of the bench seeping into my trousers. The ground beneath my boots was softer today, the kind that swallows a step without complaint. Above, the branch held a dozen drops in quiet suspense, releasing them only when the wind urged them down. There was a stillness in the camp that morning, a rare pause between the orders that usually carried us from one task to another. Somewhere in the distance, a kettle whistled. A bird, unseen, called once and was answered. And then there was the sound, the soft patter on steel, steady but never harsh. I found myself thinking about the people I had known before the war, and whether they, too, ever stopped to listen to such small things. My mother used to hang laundry on a line stretched between 2 apple trees. When it rained, the drops would roll down the cloth, darkening it before it lightened again under the sun. I had never thought much about it then, but here, in the company of helmets instead of shirts, I saw the same quiet process: water coming, water going. It's the object beneath, unchanged, yet somehow renewed. A shadow fell across the bench. Kit was Reva's. He stood for a moment, looking down at his helmet before picking it up. "Did you put them here?" I asked. He shook his head. "They were like this when I came. Thought maybe you did." I told him no. He shrugged and walked away, fastening the strap under his chin as he went. It seemed strange, this unclaimed ritual, as if the camp itself had decided the helmets belonged here in the rain. I leaned back, my gaze following the branch above. Sleeves were heavy, but not bowed, each one holding its own small world of water. The more I looked, the more I realized how much of the rain never reached the helmets at all. Most of it stayed in the leaves, releasing only what it chose. And in that, I saw a kind of mercy, a filter between the sky and the ones who bore its weight. The cook passed by with a tray of mugs, the steam curling into the cool air. He set one beside me without a word. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it warmed my hands, and for a while I simply sat there, sipping, listening to the rain trace its path from sky to leaf to steel to earth. When the others began to gather, I stayed where I was. One by one, they took their helmets and moved on. The bench emptied, the rain slowed, and the branch seemed to relax its hold. I thought about how many mornings like this might be left to us. The war could move quickly when it wanted to, and moments of quiet like this were easily swallowed. That thought made me pay even closer attention to the pattern of drops, to the smell of wet wood, to the faint glisten left on the bench where the helmets had been. In the days that followed, I began to rise earlier, drawn by the pull of that small, unclaimed ritual. Sometimes there were 2 helmets, sometimes 6, sometimes none at all. But when they were there, I was 2. Once, I found a note tucked inside one scrap of paper, folded twice, with only a single word written on it: "Stay." I didn't know whose helmet it was, or who had left the note, but I left it where I found it. It seemed wrong to claim something that wasn't meant for me, even if the word felt like it was. The rain, when it came, was always different. Some mornings, it was almost invisible, a mist that clung to the air. Others, it was a steady whisper, like pages being turned in a book no one could finish. But never here, ever in this place, did it roar. As if the branch above had made some pact with the sky to keep this patch of earth gentle, I began to think of it as a sanctuary. Not a grand one, not marked on any map, but a place where the rules of the rest of the camp didn't seem to apply. And in the quiet of those mornings, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. I felt like myself, not the version of me shaped by orders and marches and the endless weight of waiting, but the one who could sit still and let the world move at its own pace. One morning, when the rain was nothing more than a thin veil in the air, I noticed a small feather caught in the dent of one helmet, white with a single black line running down the middle. I touched it lightly, feeling how fragile it was, how easily it could be carried away. But it stayed there, anchored by nothing more than the slight curve of metal. I wondered if that was what we were doing, here catching small, delicate things in the dense life had left us, holding them just long enough to see their beauty before they were gone. By the time I returned to my bunk that day, the rain had stopped, but its echo stayed with me. And that night, as I lay in the dark, I realized I no longer needed the sound itself to feel its presence. It had settled into me, quiet and constant, like breath. I didn't touch it, only looked, wondering who had placed it there and why. The rain gathered along the edge of the cloth, forming a single bead that trembled before falling. It left a dark mark on the wood below, a mark that slowly faded as more drops joined it. The cloth was gone the next day, but the mark remained for a while, a faint shadow that I noticed each time I passed. It struck me then how much of life in the camp was like that, traces left behind by things you couldn't quite name, signs of moments you hadn't seen but could somehow feel. As the days grew shorter, the rain began to carry a sharper scent, one that reminded me of stone after lightning. The air felt heavier, as though the sky was lowering itself closer to the earth. In the evenings, the lamps glowed earlier, and their light pooled in small golden circles that didn't reach far beyond their own edges. In that shrinking world, the bench became my horizon. I could measure the passage of days, not by the calendar, but by the small changes I saw there. A new dent in a helmet, the deepening of the grain in the wood, the way the frost crept further along the bench's edge before the sun found it. One night, after a long march, I returned too tired to sleep. The camp was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels both protective and hollow. I walked toward the bench without thinking, drawn by habit more than choice. The rain had stopped, but the helmets were there, lined in shadow. The branch above rattled softly in the wind, and somewhere beyond the trees, I heard the slow rush of a river swollen by the weak storms. I sat without a coat, letting the cold find me. My breath came in small clouds, and I thought about the men who had worn each helmet that day, about the weight it had carried for them. I imagined those weights, the orders, the hours, the thoughts they didn't speak, sliding off in slow streams, dripping from the edge of the metal to the ground below. I stayed until the frost began to form, thin and bright under the weak moonlight, and only then did I return to my bunk. When I closed my eyes, I saw it all again. The line of helmets, the dark wood, the sky keeping its slow, soft promise above. The feather stayed with me for days. Not physically, I left it there on the helmet, unsure whether it belonged to me to keep but in my mind. It was as present as the smell of damp canvas or the faint metallic taste the air carried after rain. I began to look for it each morning, half expecting the wind to have taken it, half hoping it hadn't. For a while, it remained exactly where it was, anchored in that shallow dent as though it had chosen that place with purpose. When the rain came again, it darkened the feather to a soft gray, the drops rolling along its delicate barbs without breaking them. I sat and watched, almost holding my breath, as if any sudden movement might scatter it. Mickelson joined me that morning. He wasn't one for idle talk, but he followed my gaze and saw it. "Looks like it's resting," he said simply. "Resting," I repeated. He nodded. Even the smallest things need somewhere to stop. I wanted to ask him what he thought it meant, or whether he believed such things carried meaning at all. But before I could, he stood, took his helmet, and left, leaving me with the feather and the sound of rain tapping lightly on the steel. That day, I didn't see the feather again. By the time I returned in the evening, it was gone, perhaps carried away by the wind or caught in someone's jacket as they passed. But its absence didn't feel like a loss, it felt like a lesson finished. It made me realize that maybe the branch, the helmets, the reins, they weren't just part of the camp's routine. They were part of mine. And in a place where so much was decided for us, to have something of my own to notice felt like an act of quiet rebellion. As winter began to hint at its approach, the rain grew colder, sharper. The drops took longer to disappear into the helmets, leaving faint marks that lasted hours instead of minutes. I started bringing my hands close to the metal before picking mine up, as if the warmth of my palms might leave some trace of comfort behind. On the coldest morning yet, I found frost clinging to the edges of the helmets, each crystal catching the light like it had been placed there by someone with infinite patience. The branch above was bare now, no longer catching the rain, but still it seemed to shield the bench in some unseen way. The air was still, the kind of stillness that feels like a held breath, and for a long while, I didn't move. I thought about how much of this I'd never be able to explain back home. If I were to say there was a bench with helmets and the rain fell soft there, it would sound like nothing. Yet here, it was everything. It was the proof that even in a place built for war, there were corners that belonged to peace. That night, as I settled under my blanket, I could hear the rain again, not outside, but inside the rhythm it had left in me. I realized it wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a way of noticing, a way of being, and perhaps when all of this was over, it would be the one thing I carried home without having to pack. In the darkness, I thought of the feather, of Mickelson's words, of the way the helmets always seemed to return to that bench. And I understood, in a way I hadn't before, that maybe we were all just looking for somewhere soft enough to stop for a while, somewhere the rain knew how to fall without hurting. And in that thought, I finally slept deep, unbroken, and warm wild outside. The sky kept its quiet vigil over the place where the rain fell softest on the helmets. The next morning, the rain didn't come. The sky was pale and still, the kind of light that makes every sound seem louder. I almost turned back when I saw the empty bench, but something made me sit anyway. It felt strange without the soft tapping on steel, without the branches quiet dripping. The absence of rain made the bench feel exposed, as though it had lost a layer of its voice. I rested my hands on my knees and listened instead to the small sounds that the rain usually covered, the hum of distant voices, the click of someone checking a rifle, the faint scrape of a tin mug being pushed across a table. Without the rain, the camp seemed sharper, every detail unsoftened. It made me realize something I had thought about before, that the rain was more than just a sound or a sight, was a veil, blurred the edges, not just of the camp, but of my thoughts. Without it, everything felt too clear, too close. The helmets arrived late that day, carried by O'Connell and someone I didn't recognize. They placed them in a line as always, then left without speaking to me. I studied them as I always did, but without the rain's touch, they seemed heavier, somehow more dangerous, like they were only sleeping and could wake at any moment. It wasn't until 2 days later that the rain returned. I was already sitting on the bench when it began a thin silver line on the horizon, moving slowly toward us. The first drops were tentative, as if remembering the place, then came more certain, more steady. When they touched the helmets, it was like a sigh passing through the air. And I realized then that it wasn't just me who changed in the rain. The helmets themselves seemed different, less like armor, more like vessels holding the sky. That afternoon, I found myself wondering what would happen if I took my helmet there on purpose, left it to be touched by the same softness. Would it hold the rain the same way? Would I feel different when I wore it again? So I tried it. I left mine there after mess, placing it at the end of the line. I watched the drops gather on its surface, roll down, disappear into the wood. When I came back an hour later, it felt cool in my hands, not with the cold of absence, but with the calm of something that had been cared for. I wore it the next day and swore it sat differently on my head, as though the rain had washed away something I didn't know I'd been carrying. Word must have spread, though no one spoke of it directly. Over the next week, I noticed more helmets on the bench than usual. Some left longer than the morning hours. I came at dusk and found them all there, glistening in the lamplight as the rain fell in a fine mist. No one came to claim them until the bugle called for night watch. It became something unspoken between Usa's quiet agreement that the bench and the rain were theirs too, not just mine. And though no one admitted to arranging them, they were always lined just so, as if the place itself required order. One morning, I found a small stone placed on top of one helmet. It was smooth, pale gray, and shaped almost like a teardrop. I left it there, curious. The rain that day was steady and cool, pulling briefly around the stone before running off. The next morning, the stone was gone, but a similar one appeared days later on another helmet. It was as if someone was marking them, leaving behind a quiet blessing. By now, the branch above had begun to swell with the promise of spring. Tiny buds clung to its thin arms, and I imagined the leaves returning, the way they would catch the rain again. I wondered if the rain would sound different when it fell through new leaves lighter, perhaps, or with the quick patter of a crowd's applause. The helmets would be here to hear it, I thought. And maybe I would too. The frost never lasted long. By mid-morning, the pale winter sun would reach its thin hands over the trees, and the sharp edges would soften into glistening drops that slid from steel to wood, wood to earth. But in those early hours, when the camp still wore the hush of sleep, the frost was a fragile crown resting on each helmet. I learned to arrive before anyone else. There was a stillness to that time of day that made me feel as though the camp belonged to me alone. The air filled only with the faint creak of timber and the quiet shift of canvas in the wind. Even the coffee hadn't yet begun to boil, and the scent of smoke from the kitchen fires drifted thin and blue. Tap. The branch above the bench was bare now, its thin limbs like careful fingers reaching toward the sky. Without leaves, it no longer held back the rain, but somehow the drops that fell here still seemed gentler, less hurried, as though the sky remembered what this place was and had decided to keep its promise. Some mornings, there would be no helmets at all. On those days, I'd sit, anyway, watching the rain darken the wood beneath me, listening to it tap and patter in its soft, patient rhythm. I came to understand that the bench didn't need the helmets to keep its meaning. The ritual was in the noticing, not the objects. Still, when they were there, lined in quiet readiness, something in me felt steadier. It was as if their curved shapes anchored the morning, reminding me that even the tools of war could rest. One morning, I arrived to find a single helmet, its surface dull from use, with a narrow strip of cloth tucked into the chin strap. It was faded, but I could still see the pattern, thin blue stripes running across worn white. A handkerchief, perhaps, or a piece torn from a shirt. The buds on the branch opened faster than I expected. One morning, there was only the faintest green, like a memory of leaves, and the next they had unfolded enough to cast a soft shadow over the bench. When the wind moved through them, they whispered a sound different from the winter's bare limbs, lighter but still carrying that sense of watchfulness. The rain that week was warmer, and it carried the scent of earth waking. It struck the leaves first now, breaking into hundreds of tiny rhythms before finding its way down to the helmets. The sound was scattered, not the slow tapping of winter, but a delicate, restless patter, as if the season itself couldn't keep still. I sat as I always did, feeling the shift in my bones. Winter's rain had been a companion for stillness. Spring's was an invitation to look closer, to notice the movement in even the smallest places. The helmets gleamed differently too. Drops slid from them in quick curves, catching the light that slipped through the new leaves. The air around them seemed softer, as if the season had decided they deserved a gentler gaze. One morning, I noticed a pair of boots beneath the bench. Worn leather, laces frayed. No one claimed them, and they stayed there for 3 days, unmoved. I began to think of them as belonging to the bench, part of its collection of quiet artifacts. On the 4th morning, they were gone, but in their place was a folded scrap of cloth tucked into the bench as corner a square of faded red. It became clear to me then that others were leaving pieces of themselves here, in small ways, the same way I left my time. A stone, a feather, a pair of boots, a cloth. The bench had become something more than a place to rest. A helmeted had become a place to lay down whatever weight we could. The rain seemed to understand, no matter how heavy the sky grew elsewhere. Here it always fell with a kind of restraint, as if the branch above and the air around had conspired to keep its touch light. There were days when I thought I wouldn't find it again, that the war would shift us somewhere new, that orders would scatter us too far for rituals. But each morning I woke still in reach of the bench, felt like a kind of mercy, and I took it. Sometimes I wondered if the bench would exist without us, if long after we were gone it would still sit here under the branch, holding its quiet court for the rain. Maybe travelers would pass, or years would roll over it, and still the rain would fall soft here on whatever took our place. The thought was strangely comforting that something we touched could outlast us and keep its gentleness. The buds on the branch opened faster than I expected. One morning there was only the faintest green, like a memory of leaves, and the next they had unfolded enough to cast a soft shadow over the bench. When the wind moved through them, they whispered a sound different from the winter's bare limbs, lighter but still carrying that sense of watchfulness. The rain that week was warmer, and it carried the scent of earth waking. It struck the leaves first now, breaking into hundreds of tiny rhythms before finding its way down to the helmets. The sound was scattered, not the slow tapping of winter, but a delicate, restless patter, as if the season itself couldn't keep still. I sat as I always did, feeling the shift in my bones. Winter's rain had been a companion for stillness. Spring's was an invitation to look closer, to notice the movement in even the smallest places. The helmets gleamed differently too. Drops slid from them in quick curves, catching the light that slipped through the new leaves. The air around them seemed softer, as if the season had decided they deserved a gentler gaze. One morning, I noticed a pair of boots beneath the bench. Worn leather, laces frayed. No one claimed them, and they stayed there for 3 days, unmoved. I began to think of them as belonging to the bench, part of its collection of quiet artifacts. On the 4th morning, they were gone, but in their place was a folded scrap of cloth tucked into the bench as corner a square of faded red. It became clear to me then that others were leaving pieces of themselves here, in small ways, the same way I left my time. A stone, a feather, a pair of boots, a cloth. The bench had become something more than a place to rest. A helmeted had become a place to lay down whatever weight we could. The rain seemed to understand. No matter how heavy the sky grew elsewhere, here it always fell with a kind of restraint, as if the branch above and the air around had conspired to keep its touch light. There were days when I thought I wouldn't find it again, that the war would shift us somewhere new, that orders would scatter us too far for rituals. But each morning I woke still in reach of the bench, felt like a kind of mercy, and I took it. Sometimes I wondered if the bench would exist without us, if long after we were gone it would still sit here under the branch, holding its quiet court for the rain. Maybe travelers would pass, or years would roll over it, and still the rain would fall soft here on whatever took our place. The thought was strangely comforting, that something we touched could outlast us and keep its gentleness. One evening, after a long march through mud that clung like memory, I returned late to camp. The sky was low and heavy, but no rain fell. The air had that feeling it gets just before the first drop, expectant, almost holding its breath. I went to the bench anyway. The helmets were there, 7 in a row, their edges dull in the fading light. No one else lingered. The camp was quiet, voices muffled inside tents. I sat without speaking, without even taking off my gloves. Wind stirred the leaves above, carrying the faint smell of river water and damp bark. The first drops came suddenly, scattered, and I watched them splatter against the steel. They slid quickly, leaving darker streaks that disappeared almost as soon as they formed. The sound was small but certain, like fingers brushing over a drum skin. Something shifted in me then. Maybe it was the way the rain felt familiar, even though the season had changed, or the way the helmets seemed to lean into it without resistance. I thought about how much of our lives here was spent bracing for impact, and how rare it was to be met with something that didn't hurt. The rain grew steadier, filling the air with its gentle percussion. I closed my eyes and let the rhythm wash through me. I thought of winter mornings under bare branches, of frost crowns on steel, of the feather and the stone and the cloth. And I realized that this bench had been keeping more than just helmets safe. It had been keeping a part of me I had realized I'd left here. When I opened my eyes, the sky was nearly dark. The lamps around camp flickered to life, casting golden circles on the wet ground. The helmets glowed faintly in that light, each one holding a small reflection of the branch above. I stood, letting the rain run off my coat, and reached out to touch the nearest helmet. The metal was cool, but not cold, as if it remembered warmth. I left my hand there a moment longer than necessary, then stepped back. As I walked away, I didn't look back at the bench. I didn't need to. I knew it would still be there in the morning, still waiting, still catching the rain in the only way it knew, softly. And for the first time since I'd come to this place, I felt certain that when I left, some part of me would stay, not out of loss, but out of choice. Because there are places, rare places, where the world learns how to be gentle. And once you've found one, you carry its rain with you wherever you go. I didn't notice the first day without the bench. It wasn't gone, of course, not physically, but the helmets weren't there, and my boots carried me past without stopping. The air was sharp that morning, the sky a pale gray that seemed to drain the color from everything it touched. I told myself I'd sit there later, after the day's duties were done. But later came and went. It was the first time in months that I went to sleep without hearing the soft rain in my memory. The absence sat strangely in my chest, not painful, but noticeable, like a missing button on a well-worn coat. The next morning, the bench was empty again. No helmets. The branch above was still, its leaves dark from the night's rain. And for a moment, I felt the quiet press against me in a way that didn't feel like comfort. I sat anyway. The wood was damp, the air cool, and I waited as if something might appear if I was patient enough. Nothing did. It made me realize how much I had come to rely on that simple sight. The line of curved steel, the gentle tapping of drops on metal. Without it, the bench was just a bench. And yet, the more I sat, the more I began to hear it again. Not from above, but from within. I remembered winter's frost crowns, the way the helmets caught the first shy drops of spring, the offerings left without explanation. I remembered the sound, each drop spaced just enough to make you lean in, to notice. Hey, and as I sat there alone, I realized I could still hear it, even without the helmets to carry it. It was then I understood. The bench had only been the doorway. The rain, the soft kind that never hurried, that never struck too hard, had been teaching me how to listen. That day, I carried the sound with me. When I filled my canteen at the pump, I heard it in the small splash of water. When the wind stirred the leaves near my post, I heard it in the soft tapping of branch against branch. Even the distant steps of a soldier crossing wet ground seemed to echo that same patient rhythm. And for the first time, I knew that even when I left this place, I wouldn't lose it. The rain would find me again, not just in the sky, but in the way the world moves quietly when no one's watching. The days that followed felt different. Not because the work changed. The marches, the drills, the waiting all went on as before, but because the bench had become more of an idea than a place. I still visited it, sometimes finding a helmet or two, sometimes none, but I no longer depended on it to feel the weight in my shoulders lift. It was as if the rain had taught me to carry its softness with me, so that it was there when I needed it, whether the sky obliged or not. One afternoon, after a long stretch of dry days, I sat on a small rise overlooking the camp. From there, I could see the branch above the bench swaying in the wind. No helmets rested beneath it, but in my mind, they were still there, curved shapes catching the light, each holding a small piece of sky. I remembered the first time I'd seen them, lined in a perfect row, the rain falling so gently it seemed to be keeping a secret. I remembered the feather, the stone, the cloth, the boots, the quiet offerings no one claimed. And I realized they had all been saying the same thing in their own way. Here is a place where you can set something down. It struck me how rare that is in life, to find a place where you can leave part of your burden and know it will be held without judgment, without noise. When the orders came to move on, I wasn't surprised. In war, nothing stays still for long. We packed quickly, rolling canvas, checking straps, making sure nothing was left behind that could be of use to someone else. I went to the bench one last time. The morning was cool, and a thin mist hung in the air. A single helmet rested there, its surface speckled with drops, too light to be called rain. I didn't know whose it was, but I reached out and touched it anyway, letting my palm rest on the cool steel. I whispered a thank you, not to the helmet, not even to the place, but to the countless small moments it had given me. Then I stepped back, letting the mist gather where my hand had been, and walked away without looking over my shoulder. I didn't need to see it to know it would still be there. Weeks later, far from the camp, I heard it again. Not on a battlefield, not under that branch, not on steel, but on the roof of a small station where we waited for transport. The rain came softly, hesitant at first, then settling into that same unhurried rhythm I had learned to love. I closed my eyes, and there it was. The bench, the row of helmets, the faint glisten of water gathering and sliding away. I could almost smell the damp wood, hear the faint shuffle of boots on wet ground, feel the cool curve of metal beneath my palm. It didn't make me sad. It felt like meeting an old friend in a crowded place, exchanging a glance that says everything without a single word. From then on, I began noticing it everywhere. On the brim of a stranger's hat in the marketplace, catching the rain before it touched their face. On the leaves of a tree outside my window, the drops collecting and falling with measured grace. On the edge of a mug left on a porch rail, gathering a small pool before spilling over. It wasn't just water, it was the way it moved, the way it chose to fall without harm. And each time I saw it, I felt something inside me settle. I realized then that the bench and the helmets had never really been about war at all. They had been about finding a corner of the world where gentleness survived, even when everything else asked you to be hard. Now, when the rain comes softly, I let it find me. I stand in it, sit with it, walk beneath it without hurry. I let it touch my shoulders, my hair, my hands, and sometimes when I close my eyes, I can almost hear the branch above me and see the row of helmets catching the sky as small mercies. And in those moments, I know, no matter how far I've gone, a part of me is still there, sitting quietly on that bench, listening to where the rain falls softest on the helmets. Weeks later, far from the camp, I heard it again. Not on a battlefield, not under that branch, not on steel, but on the roof of a small station where we waited for transport. The rain came softly, hesitant at first, then settling into that same unhurried rhythm I had learned to love. I closed my eyes, and there it was. The bench, the row of helmets, the faint glisten of water gathering and sliding away. I could almost smell the damp wood, hear the faint shuffle of boots on wet ground, feel the cool curve of metal beneath my palm. It didn't make me sad. It felt like meeting an old friend in a crowded place, exchanging a glance that says everything without a single word. From then on, I began noticing it everywhere. On the brim of a stranger's hat in the marketplace, catching the rain before it touched their face. On the leaves of a tree outside my window, the drops collecting and falling with measured grace. On the edge of a mug left on a porch rail, gathering a small pool before spilling over. It wasn't just water, it was the way it moved, the way it chose to fall without harm. And each time I saw it, I felt something inside me settle. I realized then that the bench and the helmets had never really been about war at all. They had been about finding a corner of the world where gentleness survived, even when everything else asked you to be hard. Now, when the rain comes softly, I let it find me. I stand in it, sit with it, walk beneath it without hurry. I let it touch my shoulders, my hair, my hands, and sometimes when I close my eyes, I can almost hear the branch above me and see the row of helmets catching the sky as small mercies. And in those moments, I know, no matter how far I've gone, a part of me is still there, sitting quietly on that bench, listening to where the rain falls softest on the helmets. The rain found me again in a place I hadn't expected, far from the bench, far from the branch that had guarded it, and far from the row of helmets that had taught me to listen. It was a railway platform on the edge of a small town. The air smelled of coal, dust, and wet earth, and the clouds hung low enough that I felt I could touch them if I stood on my toes. I had been traveling for days, passing through landscapes that blurred into each other, carrying a pack that seemed heavier with memory than with anything inside it. The station roof was old iron and glass, patched in places with tin. The rain began lightly, pattering on the glass with a sound I hadn't heard since leaving the camp. At first, I thought it was just the echo of memory, my mind playing tricks on me in the stillness between trains. But when I looked up, I saw the drops sliding down the glass in thin, deliberate lines, breaking apart only when they reached the seams in the roof. And then I heard it, that same gentle rhythm, spaced in a way that made me lean closer. It wasn't the same as rain on steel helmets, but it had the same restraint, the same way of arriving without force. I sat on a wooden bench under the roof, watching the rain find its way through the small gaps, falling in soft plinks on the platform. People hurried past, heads down, collars turned up, never noticing where the drops landed. I realized then how easily such moments are missed, not because they're hidden, but because no one thinks to look for them. I wondered if anyone here had a bench like mine, a place where the world slowed enough to let them notice the small mercies. I thought about leaving something, a stone, a feather, a folded scrap of cloth, the way we had at camp, but my pack held none of those things now. All I had was time and the willingness to sit still in the rain. So I stayed until the train came, until the sound of wheels on wet tracks swallowed the rain's quiet song. And when I stepped aboard, I carried it with me, the way I always did. That night, in a small, rented room above a bakery, I dreamed of the bench. But in the dream, it wasn't in camp. It was here, on the railway platform, with the branch overhead and the helmets in a perfect line, catching the soft rain while the trains came and went. When I woke, The dream stayed with me, not as something that couldn't happen, but as something that might. I stayed in that little town for 3 days. It wasn't part of any plan. There were no orders, no maps to follow now, just a quiet pull that told me not to rush. The bakery downstairs opened early, and each morning I woke to the scent of warm bread rising through the floorboards. The woman who ran it spoke little, but always slid a small loaf into my hands before I could pay, as if she knew I was carrying something heavier than coins. On the second morning, the rain returned. I found myself walking toward the station without thinking, my boots tracing the same path as the day I had arrived. The platform was empty this time, the benches wet, the iron roof humming softly under the weight of water. I sat on the same bench, watching the drops gather on the lip of the roof before letting go. It struck me that these drops were no different from the ones that had fallen on the helmets months ago. The same sky, the same patient descent, the same way of meeting the ground without violence. The only difference was that I had changed. I now noticed them everywhere. In the far corner of the platform, I saw a child, no more than 7, crouched with a tin cup, catching the water that slipped through a crack in the roof. She held it steady, waiting for each drop as though it were a gift. When the cup filled halfway, she took a sip, then placed it back exactly where it had been. For a long time, I just watched her. It reminded me of how I had once sat beneath the branch, waiting for the rain to choose its path. I wondered if she felt the same thing I had, that small, private joy of noticing something the rest of the world ignored. Okay, when her mother called her away, she left the cup there, still catching the rain. I wanted to tell her to keep it, to carry it with her, but I stayed silent. Some things are meant to be left behind, so they can keep living where they belong. That evening, back in my room, I realized I had been smiling without knowing it. The rain had followed me here, not in the form of helmets or benches, but in the way it could still create a quiet space between one moment and the next. And I began to think, maybe that's all the bench had ever been, a space where the world slowed enough for me to hear what it was saying. By the 4th day in that town, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glazed in a thin sheen that reflected the pale morning light. I could hear the sound of wagons rolling over the cobblestones, their wheels hissing on the wet surface. I thought I might leave that day. My pack was ready and the trains were running, but something kept me still. I wandered instead, letting my boots choose the turns. The streets twisted in ways that made the town feel older than it looked, each corner revealing another narrow lane lined with shuttered windows. In one of these lanes, I found a courtyard with a fountain at its center. The water spilled from a small bronze spout, shaped like a bird's beak, landing in the stone basin below. The sound was faint, but steady, like rain slowed to a single drop at a time. I sat on the low wall of the fountain, leaning forward so I could see my reflection in the rippling water. The stone around the basin was darkened in patches where the spray had touched it, just as the bench in camp had been darkened by the rain. It made me feel, for a moment, as if I were back there. The same stillness, the same patient fall of water, the same sense that nothing needed to happen except this. An old man emerged from a doorway on the far side of the courtyard, carrying a bucket. He dipped it into the basin without speaking, then nodded at me before returning inside. I wondered how many times he had done that. How many mornings had begun with this same ritual? How many drops had fallen between the first and this one? It reminded me that rituals don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they are small, quiet acts repeated until they become part of the place itself. As I left the courtyard, I thought about the helmets, the branch, the rain. I realized that what I missed most wasn't the objects or even the sound. It was the feeling of belonging to a moment so completely that nothing else could intrude. And here, with the fountain's slow rhythm in my ears, I felt it again. On the 5th morning, I left the town. The bakery woman handed me a small loaf wrapped in cloth and pressed it into my hands without a word. The train was late, So I stood on the platform again, listening for the rain. Even though the sky was clear, it didn't come. Instead, I heard the slow creak of the station's old sign swaying in the wind, the murmur of voices from a pair of travelers waiting near the far bench, the faint rustle of a newspaper being turned page by page. None of it was rain, and yet I found myself listening in the same way, leaning toward the spaces between the sounds. The train carried me through hills streaked with the last snow of the season. Then down into valleys where streams ran quick and bright beside the tracks. I thought of the branch above the bench, of the way its leaves had caught the rain and decided which drops to let fall. Watching the streams, I wondered if the land made the same choices, sending some water forward, keeping some for itself. By nightfall, I reached another small town. There was no station roof here, just a simple wooden platform. The air was damp, the ground soft beneath my boots. I walked through narrow streets until I found an inn with a lantern hanging above the door. In my room, the window looked out onto a row of low houses with slanted roofs. As the light faded, I saw clouds gathering, thick and dark. I left the window open as I unpacked, waiting. When the rain came, it was heavier than the soft fall I remembered, but still, there were moments between the gusts when it slowed, softened, and I could almost believe I was back under that branch. I leaned on the windowsill, letting a few drops find my hands. They were cool, not cold. And in that small, quiet moment, the miles between me and the bench disappeared. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the streets still glistened as if holding onto the night's memory. I walked without aim, letting my boots follow the narrow curves between the houses until the cobblestones ended at a small square. In the center stood a statue of a man holding a book, his head bowed as though reading in silence. The stone was darkened in places where water had run down, tracing the same paths over and over through the years. I noticed a wooden bench nearby, weathered and leaning slightly to one side. No branch hung above it, no row of helmets waited there, and yet I felt the same pull I used to feel in camp. I sat, resting my hands on the worn slats, and waited. For a while, there was only the wind moving through the square. Then, slowly, a sound began, not from the sky, but from the gutters along the roof of a building across from me. A thin stream of water still trickled from the night's rain, falling in small, careful drops into a metal bucket someone had placed beneath. The sound was soft, irregular, almost shy. I leaned toward it, counting the pauses, noticing how each drop seemed to arrive alone, as if it had traveled a long way to get here. It made me think of the bench in camp again, how it had never been about the helmets themselves, but about what happened around them, above them, between the drops. A woman came into the square, carrying 2 loaves of bread under her arm. She glanced at me, then at the bucket, and smiled faintly before disappearing down a side street. I wondered if she, too, had listened to that sound before, if it was her bucket, her quiet ritual. I stayed until the trickle slowed to nothing, the bucket half full, the metal shining faintly in the morning light. Then I stood, feeling lighter than when I had arrived, and continued walking. That day, I realized something important. I no longer needed the bench or the helmets to find the place where the rain falls softest. It could be anywhere, as long as I was willing to stop and listen. It happened in a market. The square was crowded that afternoon, full of the hum of voices, the clatter of wooden crates, the hiss of bread pulled fresh from stone ovens. The air smelled of fruit just beginning to turn, of damp burlap sacks, of warm spice carried from the far stalls. I wasn't looking for it, not here, not in the noise and movement of so many people, but somewhere between a table stacked with apples and a cart selling cloth. I heard it. It wasn't from the sky. The day was bright and dry, the sun catching on every jar of honey and bottle of oil. The sound came from a stall where a man was selling flowers. Beside him, a small clay jar sat beneath a narrow pipe that dripped water. one slow drop at a time, onto a stone dish before spilling into the jar. The sound was almost lost in the chatter around it, but I caught it. That same delicate rhythm I had heard on the bench in camp, on the station roof, in the courtyard fountain. It was softer than everything else, but once I found it, it filled the whole square for me. Stood near the stall longer than I needed to, pretending to study the flowers. The drops landed as if they had nowhere else to be, each one arriving with the same patience as the last. The man noticed me staring at the jar and smiled. "Wait, it keeps them fresh," he said, gesturing to the flowers. I nodded, but in my mind, I was far away, back under the branch, with helmets lined in quiet readiness, the rain falling as if it knew us. I bought a single flower, more for the sound than for the color, and walked away with it in my hand. The market noise rose again around me, but the rhythm stayed, steady and sure, as if it had decided to follow me for the rest of the day. It came to me at night, in a place where the air was dry enough to crack wood. I was staying in a small boarding house on the edge of a dusty road. The windows were open to let in what little breeze there was, but the sky held no clouds, only the faint glimmer of stars scattered across a black stretch. I lay in bed, not yet ready to sleep, when I began to hear it. Not the patter of water, but something else, a slow, irregular tapping against the wooden frame of the building. It took me a moment to place it. Wind pushing a loose shutter, making it knock gently against the wall. The sound was soft, never urgent, and it carried the same rhythm the rain once had. Closed my eyes, letting the sound fill the room. It was strange how something that wasn't tea water could carry the memory of it so perfectly. Each tap felt like a drop landing, and I realized then that what I had been chasing all this time wasn't rain itself, but the way rain moves through the world when it isn't in a hurry. I remembered the helmets, the weight of them in my hands, the way they cooled under the rain's touch, the offerings left without words. I remembered the bench, how it had been a kind of anchor, a place where time moved differently. And here, in a dry place far from all of that, the same stillness found me again. The shutter tapped, paused, tapped again. Between each sound was a silence deep enough to rest in. When sleep finally came, it was the kind that feels like drifting into a place you've already been, familiar, safe, unbroken. It was weeks later when I found myself walking a road I hadn't meant to take. The land here still bore the quiet scars of war, the faint lines where trenches once cut through fields, the scattered stones where walls had fallen long ago. The grass had grown back, taller in some places, hiding what lay beneath. But there was a stillness in the air that told me the ground remembered. At the edge of an open field, I saw what was left of a building. Only two walls remained standing, leaning toward each other like tired men, sharing the same weight. In the corner between them was a wooden crate, weathered to silver by the years. Stepped closer, and that's when I heard it. Faint, but unmistakable. Slow drip, finding its way through the broken roof above, landing into a small metal pot someone had left there. The water wasn't falling from rain. The day was dry. It must have been seeping through the cracks of some old pipe, or from the morning dew gathered in the timbers. But the sound, patient, each drop spaced just enough apart to let you hear the quiet in between. Sat on a fallen beam, leaning forward so I could watch the drops fall. The metal pot shook slightly with each one, a tiny vibration that sent ripples across the thin layer of water inside. It struck me how life finds ways to keep its rhythms, even here. In a place where voices had once shouted, where boots had once pounded the earth, the world had returned to a slower pace. I stayed until the sun began to lower, until the light in the pot turned from silver to gold. And when I finally stood to leave, I realized I felt lighter, as though the sound had taken something from me, something I didn't need anymore. It happened in a library. I had stopped in the town only for a night, but when I saw the tall windows and the carved wooden doors, I felt the pull to go inside. The air was cool and faintly scented with paper and dust, the kind of dust that doesn't come from neglect, but from time passing quietly. The place was nearly empty. Only a few people moved between the shelves, their footsteps softened by the worn carpet. I wandered without aim, my fingers trailing along the spines of books whose titles had faded to gold ghosts on the leather. And then I noticed it. A rhythm. Not the drip of water this time, but the gentle, steady tread of someone walking across the far side of the room. Each step was placed with care, the pauses between them long enough to hear the whisper of pages being turned. It reminded me instantly of the rain on the helmets, the way each drop had arrived alone, with space enough around it for the world to breathe. The footsteps had the same patience, the same unhurried certainty. I turned a corner and saw her, an older woman carrying a small stack of books. She walked as though the weight in her arms deserved her full attention, her feet making no more sound than a fingertip on cloth. I didn't speak to her. Instead, I let the sound follow me as I moved through the aisles, letting it slow my own steps. I found a seat near the window, opened a book I had no intention of finishing, and listened until the footsteps faded away. When I left, the streets outside were dry, but I realized I didn't miss the rain. The world had found another way to give it back to me. It was near dusk when I saw it. I had been walking along a dirt road that led nowhere in particular, the air heavy with the scent of grass warmed by the day. The sun had already slipped behind a hill, leaving the sky a pale wash of blue-gray. That's when the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint shimmer of something ahead. At first, I thought it was water, a stream catching the last of the light. But as I drew closer, I saw it for what it was. The wind moving through a grove of aspen trees, their pale leaves flashing in the fading sun. It wasn't sound that reached me first, but light, the way each leaf caught it for only a heartbeat before letting it go, passing it to the next. It moved like rain, falling not downward, but sideways, leaf to leaf, a ripple of silver gold that traveled across the grove in waves. I stopped at the edge, letting my eyes follow the motion. The rhythm was irregular, like the drops on the helmets had been, yet it had the same gentleness. Each flash of light seemed to wait its turn, never rushing, never stealing from the one before it. For a long time, I simply stood there, my boots in the soft dirt, my hands resting loosely at my sides. There was no branch above me, no bench, no steel, and yet the feeling was the same. The world had once again found a new way to give me the softness I thought only the rain could hold. When the wind finally stilled, the light faded with it. The grove became just trees again, their leaves darkening into night. But the rhythm stayed in my chest, steady, patient, unbroken. It was in the evening, inside a small inn where I had taken shelter from a sudden wind. The common room was warm with lamplight, a low fire flickering in the hearth. A handful of travelers sat scattered at tables, eating in quiet conversation. In the far corner, a man was speaking to the innkeeper. His voice wasn't loud enough for me to catch the words, but the tone, that was what I noticed first. It had the softness of rain that knows exactly where it is falling, low, steady, each syllable landing with the same unhurried care. I turned slightly, letting the sound reach me without intruding. It reminded me of the spaces between drops, the way the helmets had once caught them, the pauses that made the sound fuller by not filling it completely. His voice had the same kind of space, the same trust in the quiet around it. He laughed once, not the quick bark of surprise, but something gentler, like water rolling over smooth stone. I felt my shoulders ease, as if the sound itself carried weight away from me. When I finished my meal, I left without speaking to him. Some things don't need to be touched to be carried. I stepped out into the cool night, and though the sky was clear, I could still hear it, that soft, careful rhythm of a voice that knew how to land without breaking what it touched. It was a year later when I returned. Not to the same camp. That place belonged to another time, but to a stretch of land that carried the same quiet in its air. I had been walking for most of the day, my pack lighter now, my boots worn enough to know the shape of every mile. The path led me through a small stand of trees, their branches bending gently toward each other like old friends leaning close. Beyond them, in a clearing, I saw it. Not the bench I had known, but a bench all the same. Weathered wood, a little crooked, the grain darkened by years of sun and rain, and above it, a branch. Not the same branch, not the same tree, but it carried the same weight of green, the same way of catching the sky's offerings. I sat without thinking, my hands resting on my knees, and I waited. At first, there was only stillness. Then, as if remembering me, the rain began. Not heavy, not hurried, just enough to touch the leaves above. It paused there, gathering itself, before letting go in drops that landed soft on the bench beside me. I closed my eyes. In the rhythm, I heard everything. The winter frost on steel, the feather in the dent of a helmet, the stone on the crown, the child with the tin cup, the trickle into the metal bucket. The footsteps in the library, the shimmer of light through aspen leaves, the softness of a stranger's voice. It was all here. Every place I had carried with me, every quiet moment that had taught me the same lesson, that there are corners of the world where gentleness survives. And if you learn to notice them, you can carry them anywhere. The rain slowed, then stopped, but I didn't move. Some part of me knew this was not the end, that I would keep finding it, in other benches, under other branches, in other forms I could not yet imagine. And as I rose to leave, I didn't look back, 'cause I knew, wherever I went next, the rain would find me.